It all began in the thick of a brutal war, where the ground was choked with the fallen. In the center of the carnage, a man coughed up a thick spray of blood, reeling from a blow that should have been his end. The holy sword of the knightly order had pierced him true, buried deep within his chest. Seeing this, the soldiers erupted into cheers, their voices heavy with the relief of men who had finally conquered a nightmare. The man bleeding out on the dirt was known to all as the feared demon of the continent, Ashimon, the most powerful necromant the world had ever seen. As his life ebbed away, the mage realized his time was finally up. It had been 10 long years of a war that had bled into every corner of the land. He had tried to bolster his defenses against this final assault, but in the end his spells had failed him. Looking at the pile of skulls beside him, he accepted that this was his perfect defeat. And the man responsible was the lone knight standing before him, Berkel Heinen. However, the leader of the knights did not claim the glory for himself. He spoke with a heavy voice, explaining that this victory wasn't won alone. Countless souls had fought and died just so his blade could finally reach its mark. Berkel pleaded with the archmage to surrender now, for the sake of peace and the common people. This plea only fueled Ashimon's rage. He let out a ragged scream, telling the knight to shut his mouth. With venom in his voice, he accused the knights of standing idly by while a plague slaughtered the innocent. To the mage, these holy warriors were worse than common beasts, and he ended his tirade by branding every single one of them a pathetic hypocrite. Suddenly, a sickly green aura began to pulse from Ashimon's body as he forced himself to stand. The soldiers watched in total shock, terrified that he still had the strength to wield his necromancy even with a shattered heart. His comrades shouted warnings of the danger, but Berkel simply commanded the mage to stop his madness. He revealed the grim toll of the war. 20 million people had died only to be raised as puppets in the necromancer's army. Ashimon remained cold, mocking the knight for his perceived stupidity. Berkel then struck a nerve, accusing the mage of being driven by nothing, more than a twisted desire for vengeance for his own fallen people. The necromancer challenged him to prove him wrong, and for a moment, Berkel fell silent. Then, the knight spoke of the true reason he had fought his way to this battlefield. He stared down his enemy with eyes full of unwavering determination, his sword beginning to glow with a brilliant light. He declared that everything he did, every drop of blood spilled, was for the future of the children. The archmage's body froze at those words. The hero spoke of leaving behind a legacy of hope for the next generation. And in that moment, Ashimon saw something that broke him. In the reflection of Berkel's eyes, he saw his own corrupted, twisted form, but looking deeper. He saw a ghost of his former self. He saw the pure, justice-filled eyes of a knight he used to be, a man completely different from the monster he had become. As Berkel prepared his final strike, thinking of the descendants who would inherit the world, the necromancer was overcome with shock. His strength evaporated, and he finally collapsed to his knees in the dirt. The knight raised his sword high, preparing to deliver the final blow that would end the era of the demon of the continent. The time had come for the final blow to end it all. But just as Berkel stepped forward, he suddenly stumbled, causing his men to gasp in concern at the unexpected lapse. In that fleeting opening, Ashimon gripped a new sword etched with dark, pulsing runes and whispered a final taunt to his executioner. He asked Berkel if he had any last words, his lips curling into a bloody smile as he declared that killing a man of his stature was never going to be that simple. Despite being drenched in his own lifeblood, the necromancer clearly had one last card to play. Suddenly, a violent, shadowy energy erupted from his body, surging toward Berkel with terrifying force. The knight was hurled backward by the raw magical pressure as Ashimon's eyes ignited with a strange, mysterious power. Holding his blade high, he prepared a final act of vengeance against the world. A blinding explosion of light consumed the battlefield, and as the dust settled, the soldiers began to cheer, believing the enemy had finally fallen. Lying broken on the ground, the mage heard the sickening crack of his own neck. As the sounds of victory faded into the distance, his consciousness slipped away, his eyes closing slowly on the blurred silhouette of someone standing over him. And so, the 10-year war that had ravaged the continent finally came to an end. This was the death of the demon of the continent, the necromancer known as Ashimon. Yet, in what should have been his final moment, something inexplicable occurred. The scene shifted abruptly to a massive, opulent mansion during a night of raging storms. Inside, two maids were buzzing with excitement, having noticed the young master's lips twitch for the first time. Confused by the warmth and the unfamiliar surroundings, the mage wondered what on earth was happening. He had been reborn as a baby named Cleanse, with no inkling of where he was or how he had arrived. One of the maids showed him a portrait of a duchess, identifying the woman as his mother. As she tried to coax him into speaking, he felt his tiny infant body grow rigid with effort. With a Herculean struggle, the small boy attempted to force out words. The maids were astonished, thinking the prodigy was trying to speak his first words, but in reality, he was trying to summon his dark servants to obey his command. He screamed for them to heed him, but to the women, it was merely the frightened wailing of a child. At that moment, a bolt of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the dark night with a fierce, white glow that swallowed the mansion whole. 15 years passed in the blink of an eye, and the mansion's garden fountain now sparkled brilliantly under the warm afternoon sun. A group of young ladies stood nearby, their expressions a mix of genuine surprise and breathless admiration. A young man walked calmly through the vast estate, his stride steady and poised. The girls began to whisper amongst themselves, completely enchanted by his striking face and his flowing hair. Then, the transformation was revealed in full. A breathtakingly handsome youth with hair as white as snow. He possessed an appearance so perfect it seemed as though he had been sculpted by the gods themselves. The ladies sighed, gushing over how dazzling the young Master Cleanse had become, with one of them wondering aloud what he could possibly eat to achieve such divine beauty. The girls were left wondering what divine nectar a person would have to consume to look so ethereal. Their daydreaming was cut short when a man approached Cleanse in the garden, lugging a heavy bucket. Without warning, he doused the boy in holy water, screaming for the evil spirit to vacate the vessel it inhabited. This was Garrison, a priest who had been convinced since the beginning that something was deeply wrong with young Cleanse. He pointed a finger at the 3 nearby girls, claiming they had already fallen under the boy's dark influence. Sopping wet and unimpressed, Cleanse asked if the priest ever grew tired of this endless purification ritual. Garrison doubled down, insisting that the soul of the Archmage Ashimon resided within the boy. Even as Cleanse denied being a necromancer, the priest caught a glimpse of his cold expression and splashed him with yet another bucket of holy water. Walking away, Cleanse muttered to himself, wondering if the priest was genuinely insane, calling him a psychopath under his breath. Garrison, hearing the insult, ordered his men to seize the boy and drag him away, declaring that he needed a bath in boiled water to learn his lesson. As he was dragged off, the youth reflected on the day he had died. He remembered his execution vividly, followed by the jarring sensation of waking up in an infant's body, because his first words had been a dark necromantic incantation. He had been branded a demon from birth. It was in that vulnerable state that he first met the priest of the Holy Order. Garrison. Cleanse recalled the giant silhouette of the man looming over him. A meeting that marked the beginning of 15 years of absolute misery. His upbringing included 24-hour prayer marathons that never ceased, forced baths in freezing garlic water, and purifying fire shows, where he was bound to a cross for all to see. Under the guise of holy rituals, he had endured every form of torture imaginable. Now, 15 years later, he sat at his own party with a look of utter disdain. His personal maid, Aaron, prayed fervently that he would follow the legacy of a hero, but Cleanse looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Losing his patience with the religious atmosphere, he stood up and hurled his party hat across the room. Aaron looked crushed, complaining that she had made that hat with her own hands and heart. Feeling a sudden pang of guilt for upsetting her, Cleanse moved to retrieve the item and apologize. However, his sympathy vanished the moment Aaron revealed that it was actually Priest Garrison who had crafted the hat. Cleanse froze in his tracks, his face twisting into an expression of pure horror and visceral disgust. Just then, Garrison appeared behind him, his voice booming as he called out Cleanse's name. The priest seemed moved to tears, touched that the boy had supposedly worn the hat for an entire week without taking it off. In response, Cleanse took the hat and crushed it beneath his heel, smiling as he declared he would never wear such trash again. Garrison erupted, screaming that the evil spirit of Ashimon had finally revealed its true colors. The heated confrontation was abruptly cut short, however, by the sudden arrival of Commander Dunkel, whose presence shifted the heavy tension of the garden in an instant. Commander Dunkel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension as he remarked that the rumors of the boy being the reincarnation of Ashimon had been circulating for over a decade. He reminded the priest that the Holy Order itself had officially declared there was nothing abnormal about the child. Upon hearing this, Garrison immediately released his grip on Cleanse, nodding in deferential agreement with the commander. Scrambling up from the floor, the boy realized that while the priest chose to ignore him, he obeyed Dunkel without hesitation. It was a cold realization. The priest wasn't just a fanatic. He was a shark who knew exactly how to play the game of politics. As the clergyman turned to leave the hall, he paused to cast one last glance back, warning that there was always a chance for something to happen in the distant future. With that ominous parting shot, he bid everyone farewell, only to pop his head back in to cheerfully remind Cleanse that their next purification ritual was scheduled for the coming Friday. Cleanse watched him wave, his blood boiling with a silent rage, as he muttered an "until then" through gritted teeth. Left alone, the young man slammed his fist into a sofa, his frustration overflowing. He couldn't wrap his head around how a man could systematically torture a child and still be revered as a holy cleric. Aaron approached him tentatively with a towel, whispering a question that had haunted her for years. Was he truly no longer the Archmage? Cleanse denied it with every fiber of his being, swearing he never wanted to hear that name again as long as he lived. Privately, however, his thoughts were a storm of secrets. He knew he couldn't reveal the truth to a soul. Since his rebirth, his life had been a gilded cage, monitored constantly because of the rumors, even leading to him being imprisoned within a monastery for 7 agonizing years. Seeking to change the subject, the boy asked about the executor, wondering if it was a high-ranking position within the order. The man standing beside him took on a somber tone, explaining that the title belonged to the strongest warrior in the entire order, a fact that genuinely surprised Cleanse. It was said that almost no one could stand against an executor, with the sole exception being the Duke of Cleanse's own noble family. Impressed by the sheer power of his bloodline, Cleanse began to clap his hands in genuine excitement. He curiously asked, who was considered the strongest duke in the history of their house? The man noted that while the 7th Duke, Cleanse's own father, was formidable, the 1st Duke remained the pinnacle of strength. Cleanse was taken aback. He had assumed the current line reached the peak. But the man remained firm in his conviction that the founder was unrivaled. Seeing the boy's intense interest, the man simply agreed with the young master to please him. Aaron noticed that Cleanse's gaze had become fixed on a particular portrait hanging on the wall of the grand hall. Commander Dunkel reflected on the irony of it all, thinking how no one could have ever predicted such a twist of fate. It had been 200 years since the 1st Duke founded their house, and as Cleanse stared at the gallery of his ancestors, he still struggled to process the absurdity of his new life. He scanned the portraits of the men who came before him, his eyes finally landing on the very 1st Duke, the strongest of the lineage. There, framed in gold and looking back with eyes full of justice, was the 1st Duke of the Heinen family, Berkel Heinen himself. The necromancer Ashimon had not just been reborn. He had been reincarnated as the direct descendant of the man who had killed him. The echo of his own dying scream still rang in his ears the moment he had spat his rival's name with his final breath. He remembered the weight of Berkel's words, that maddeningly noble declaration that the slaughter was all for the sake of the children's future. With that final, brutal stroke, the villainous necromancer had plummeted toward the frozen, snow-covered earth, defeated and broken. Suddenly the young boy jolted awake in his bed, his chest heaving as he fought to steady his breath against the plush mattress of his luxury suite. He cursed the recurring nightmare of his past life. Centuries ago, he had been a titan of malice who nearly ground the continent to dust, only to be cut down by a hero and spat back out into the world 200 years later. Running a hand through his snow-white hair, he grumbled to himself, unable to reconcile his current delicate reflection with the monster he used to be. The heavy silence of the room was shattered by a chilling voice from the doorway, mockingly noting that the young master was talking in his sleep again. Standing there with a sinister, knowing grin, Priest Garrison prodded him about those memories, causing Cleanse to scramble for an excuse about simple exhaustion. Before he could recover, his red-haired maid Aaron burst into the room in a state of high agitation. She blurted out that she had overheard his dark sleep talk and began mimicking his villainous mutterings aloud. In a panic, Cleanse lunged to silence her, desperately pleading for her to hold her tongue before things got worse. It was too late. The head butler arrived to announce that the family's sword exhibition was beginning, and hearing the reports of the boy's strange behavior, Garrison coldly declared that Cleanse's purification sessions would be doubled, clamping his hand over Aaron's mouth. The young heir trembled with a mixture of suppressed rage and disbelief at the sheer injustice of his situation. As they moved toward the courtyard, Cleanse mentally hurled every curse word in his vocabulary at the priest, convinced the man was a total lunatic. He turned to the servants to ask about the sword event, and the butler explained that the Duke himself had personally commanded Cleanse's presence at the ceremony. Surprised by the sudden interest from his father, he reached for a handkerchief offered by a young maid. The mustachioed butler snapped at the girl for bothering the master, but Cleanse stepped in to defend her, handing her a biscuit that sent her into a state of pure, munching bliss. As he gazed out at the grand estate, he tried to deduce the motive behind his father's summons. The butler then dropped the other shoe. Relatives from the secondary branch of the family had arrived for a visit. Cleanse's expression soured instantly. He knew exactly what kind of annoying political theater awaited him. The moment he entered the hall, the noble relatives swarmed, their eyes lighting up with malice. They immediately began to mock him, pointedly using the name of the ancient villain just to see him flinch. They laughed amongst themselves, loudly reminding everyone that the demon child had spent 7 miserable years rotting away in a monastery. Cleanse watched them, with cold, calculating eyes, identifying the gluttons from the northern branch, who had clearly only shown up to stuff their faces for free. His gaze then shifted to a blonde girl, whose posture radiated an insufferable arrogance. Another relative from the side branch who looked ready to turn, the family gathering into a battlefield of insults. The girl from the western branch maintained a posture of cold superiority, her eyes judging everyone in the room as if they were beneath her very breath. Ignoring the petty provocations and the stinging insults, the primary heir simply walked straight past the group, leaving them fuming in his wake. One of the cousins finally lost his patience, his face reddening as he barked out a question, asking if that piece of trash truly intended to ignore them in his own home. The snobbish noble continued to shout, but the former archmage found it almost comical that these branch members acted as if they owned the estate. With a gaze like ice, Cleanse stated flatly that he didn't even bother to commit the names of such people to memory. Internally, he noted with a hint of disdain that the main family must truly be in decline. If these upstarts felt bold enough to show such blatant disrespect within these walls. Suddenly, the crowd's attention shifted toward the arena, where two young swordsmen were locked in an intense sparring match. A youth with purple hair lunged forward, pouring his nervous energy into a desperate strike against his opponent. However, the pressure was too much. He buckled under the counteroffensive and tumbled backward, hitting the ground in defeat. Seething with humiliation, the purple-haired boy demanded that his opponent stop hesitating and actually fight him with everything he had. The golden-haired boy standing over him blocked the subsequent flurry of attacks with effortless grace, a confident and calm smile playing on his lips as he declared the match was already over. This was the prodigy Dellen Rhineland, Cleanse's older half-brother, whose sheer aura of superiority made it clear. Why he was the one upholding the family's prestigious name. Cleanse watched the exchange closely, his eyes beginning to glow with a faint, mystical purple hue as he activated his magical sight to dissect their abilities. Driven by desperation, the opponent attacked again, swearing that things would be different this time. Dellen surged forward, his sword becoming a blur. While the opponent tried to counter at any cost, Dellen maintained absolute control, weaving through the strikes and dodging a downward slash with fluid ease. Suddenly, Dellen became enveloped in a brilliant golden energy, his movements accelerating beyond the human eye as he prepared a special technique. Cleanse recorded every detail, using his eyes to analyze Dellen's footwork, the shifting of his weight, and the precise moment he used the tip of his toe to propel himself forward with explosive force. The purple-haired rival, blinded by rage, attempted a final, decisive blow aimed squarely at Dellen's face. Cleanse watched in awe as even the hidden flow of mana within the family's secret art was revealed to his gaze. In a split second, Dellen unleashed an explosive strike, the famous meteor sword technique, hitting his opponent dead center. The judge immediately halted the bout, declaring Dellen the victor, ever the polite superior. The blonde youth offered a gentle, friendly smile, though he noted that his opponent would have been seriously injured had the strike landed with full intent. As the guests whispered in wonder at the execution of such a high-level technique, Cleanse realized the display was a calculated warning to the secondary families. Dellen then spotted his younger brother and approached with a mocking grin, asking if he had been watching for long and teasing that he would have tried. Even harder had he known Cleanse was in the audience. Looking at his brother's perfect skill and his mask of false kindness, the ancient villain felt a wave of genuine disgust, all while wondering what the true motive was behind the gathering of all these branch families. The atmosphere in the grand hall shifted, instantly as the presence of the seventh head of the clan, Duke Henkelenland, was felt by everyone. Cleanse felt a jolt of alarm as his father approached, the room falling into a heavy, suffocating silence. The Duke offered a rare nod of approval toward his eldest son, recognizing the immense effort Dellen had put into reach such a high level of mastery. The former archmage watched this exchange with a cynical eye, realizing that Dellen was the sole source of pride for the Duke and the entire family. Commander Dunkel chimed in, noting that Dellen's domain over the blade was truly extraordinary for his age. Ever the performer, the blonde youth bowed his head with feigned humility, claiming he still had much to learn. As the patriarch walked past, he spoke briefly of the heroic legacy they carried, and Dellen bowed in deep, devoted respect. Then, the Duke turned his gaze toward Cleanse, a gaze that was frigid, sharp, and dripping with undisguised contempt. Without a single word of affection, the Duke stared at the boy, his silence broadcasting the shame he felt over this failed heir. Then, to the shock of the assembled guests, the leader reached out and touched the silver-haired boy's head, only to coldly declare that he felt not a single spark of mana residing within him. Cleanse lowered his head and offered a quiet apology, fully aware that in this world, a noble without magic was considered little more than dead. Wait. Commander Dunkel stepped in to defend the boy, suggesting that the years spent isolated in the monastery had simply stunted his development. However, the damage was done. The crowd began to whisper maliciously, gossiping about the heir who possessed no mana at all. They muttered that if the main line had become this useless, it was time for the branch families to seize control. Walking away through the long corridors, Cleanse told himself he could endure the insults thrown at his person, but then he remembered Berkel's famous words about protecting the future. Clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white, a tidal wave of rage surged within him. The former archmage found it a bitter irony that he had lost his life to a man whose lineage had devolved into such pathetic trash. As the guests began to depart, the mockery didn't stop. Dalton, the purple-haired youth from the Branch family, blocked Cleanse's path and began to taunt him, asking how a highborn heir could be so incompetent that he didn't even know how to swing a sword. The meddler continued his tirade, branding the boy a disgrace to the Henlin name. Remaining outwardly calm, Cleanse looked at Dalton and saw him for exactly what he was. A talentless busybody of zero value. When Dalton raised his fists in a fit of pique, Cleanse casually called him both naive and incredibly stupid. Enraged by the insult, Dalton stomped the ground with violent force, preparing to strike. But in a flash of movement, the young heir swept Dalton's legs out from under him, sending the loudmouth crashing face first into the hard stone floor. Blood began to leak from Dalton's nose as he lay there, stunned, listening to Cleanse coldly advise him not to take his frustrations out on others. Desperate and humiliated, Dalton screamed a final low blow, calling the silver-haired boy a motherless bastard. At those words, Cleanse turned his head, his eyes igniting with a terrifying, predatory glow of pure fury. Seeing that demonic expression, the coward froze, his skin turning pale as he broke into a cold sweat of genuine terror. As he stared down the trembling boy, the former villain reflected that the real rot in this family was the disgusting superiority complex of people like Dalton. With a flicker of ancient magic beginning to stir in his veins, the necromancer wondered just how much longer he would have to play the part of the weakling. It was a bitter pill to swallow, seeing how far the clan had fallen. Cleanse recalled the divine, radiant image of the hero who had slain him, and he couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for the pathetic state of Burkel's descendants. His grim reflection was interrupted by the arrival of the commander, whose voice boomed through the corridor, ordering the injured Dalton to cease his pathetic scandal. With a posture as unyielding as iron, the knight made it clear that he would no longer tolerate such blatant disrespect under his watch. Dalton gnashed his teeth in a silent, impotent fury, lacking the courage to talk back to a man of the commander's caliber. As he retreated, he threw a final, snide remark over his shoulder, telling Cleanse he should be grateful for having such a protective bodyguard. The loser scurried away in a ridiculous hopping gait, leaving the commander staring after him in confusion. Resting his hand firmly on the hilt of his sword, the knight assured Cleanse that the area was now secure. The silver-haired boy watched his subordinate with a distant, unreadable expression before breaking the silence. He looked at the knight and asked, quite simply, if he had a spare sword he could borrow. Later that night, the two walked deep into a dark forest, the ground swallowed by a thick, swirling mist. Halting their trek, the great warrior handed a heavy, cold steel blade directly to the boy. The commander questioned why the young master required a weapon at such an hour, but Cleanse remained silent, gripping the hilt and falling into a combat stance that mirrored his brother's. Seeing this, the guard decided it was time to head back to the mansion, deducing that the boy was likely just clinging to a desperate dream of becoming a swordsman. In his heart, the warrior felt a surge of pity. He knew that without a single drop of mana, all the effort in the world was futile. A person without magical power could never hope to become a knight of the Empire. Unaware of these thoughts, the boy began to swing the blade through the damp air, focusing entirely on his training despite his supposed inability to use the family's secret arts. Closing his eyes, the former archmage summoned the memories of the arena with crystalline clarity. He began to repeat the incredible footwork he had seen Dellen execute, his body moving with a precision that defied his young age. With a perfect leap, he synchronized the timing of his impulse, flawlessly copying the genius technique. Suddenly, a volatile purple aura began to coil around the sharp edge of the blade. As he recreated the sword's trajectory with terrifying perfection, purple sparks began to hiss and crackle intensely around his glowing eye. Sensing a sudden violent shift in the atmosphere, the commander spun around, his breath catching in his throat. He stood paralyzed, unable to process the overwhelming aura of power radiating from the boy he had thought was a weight. In that heartbeat, the air unleashed a colossal strike of pure, jagged purple energy toward a massive boulder. But just as the power peaked, a sharp light tore through the boy's pupil, disrupting the flow of his immense power. The shadowy aura shattered, dissolving into the cold night wind like glass. Despite the interruption, the enormous rock was sliced clean in half, the smooth surface of the cut glowing faintly. The commander was left utterly speechless, his reality crumbling as he stared at the destruction. Cleanse turned around slowly, his grip on the blade firm and steady. A surprised, knowing smile played on his lips as he realized that the ancient power he once wielded was finally beginning to answer his call once more. He had truly done it. He had replicated that powerful technique with chilling accuracy. Nearby, the young maid Erin stood frozen. Her jaw dropped in a state of complete and utter shock, unable to comprehend the sheer impossibility of what she had just witnessed. The commander wasn't faring much better, a single bead of sweat rolling down his temple as he stared at the severed boulder, his mind reeling from the realization that the manaless boy was anything but. The scene shifted abruptly to the next morning, finding the young heir with his head plunged deep into a bucket of water. The commander stood over him, casually noting that the boy could now hold his breath for well over a minute. Gasping for air as he pulled his head back out, Cleanse had to endure the knight's dry humor about his aquarium rituals. He shouted at the guard, who only laughed in response, though the knight's eyes sharpened as he admitted he had felt a distinctly sinister energy radiating from the young master's room earlier. As the maid began to dry the silver-haired boy's damp locks, a servant approached with a formal air bearing a sealed envelope. The messenger informed him that Dalton had sent a personal invitation. Cleanse blinked, momentarily blanking on the name, until the servant reminded him of the apology Dalton wished to offer. The former archmage recalled the pathetic punch the boy had attempted and immediately scoffed. He knew an idiot like that wasn't looking for forgiveness. Gripping the parchment, the silver-haired heir felt his suspicion grow. Upon reading the contents, he discovered the invitation was for a hunting competition, a classic setup that practically screamed trap. It was obvious that his enemy just wanted a convenient excuse to drag him out into the wilderness, away from the safety of the manor. When the messenger asked for his final word, Cleanse looked up with a sharp, determined glint in his eyes, stating he saw no reason to refuse. He knew he held the ultimate advantage. As he glanced toward the sword leaning against the wall, he realized that his time spent obsessing over his brother's movements had revealed a terrifying new talent. He could copy any ability perfectly after seeing it just once. The commander moved to prepare the carriage for the upcoming hunt, insisting that he would accompany the boy to ensure his safety. He eyed Cleanse suspiciously, asking what kind of scheme the young master was cooking up this time. With a serious expression, the silver-haired boy reminded the guard of their previous conversation about the shifts in his power. The knight responded that for some reason, he felt an entirely different weight in the air today. A dark, foreboding energy that seemed to follow them as the carriage began its bumpy journey toward the distant castle. The terrain was treacherous and uneven, causing the carriage to lurch violently as they entered the woods. Inside the cramped space, poor little Erin was turning a shade of green, clutching her stomach as she succumbed to motion sickness. She ended up slumped against the commander, who sighed and muttered that he had warned her not to come. Before offering a pillow for her to rest on, Cleanse looked out at the dense foliage, explaining that the forest floor was always unforgiving for those unaccustomed to its paths. The great warrior encouraged the girl to sleep it off, clearly moved by what he thought was the young master's kindness, only for Cleanse to bluntly clarify that the pillow was strictly for Erin's comfort, not the knight's. Falling into a pensive silence, the white-haired boy stared out the window at the passing trees. He watched the ancient woods with a distant gaze, reflecting on how much the world had changed in 2 centuries. He remembered that 200 years ago, this very place had looked entirely different. The land, now lush and vibrant, had once been a desolate expanse buried under heavy snow and the cold weight of the dead. The former villain gazed at the transformed landscape with a distant, pensive look, a flicker of begrudging respect crossing his mind as he realized that Burkel had truly succeeded in turning this graveyard into a better world. His reverie was broken when a guard swung the carriage door open, announcing their arrival at the sprawling estate of the Corwell family. Stepping out onto the gravel, Cleanse looked up at the towering structure, surprised to find that the manor appeared even more opulent than his own ducal residence. He dryly noted that for a mere children's hunting competition, the hosts certainly had an obscene amount of money to burn. Suddenly, a familiar grating voice pierced the air, calling his name from across the grounds. Dalton approached, flanked by a pack of lean, panting hunting dogs, and asked with a sneer what the silver-haired trash was staring at. He boasted openly that the luxury of the manor had been funded by wealth siphoned from Cleanse's own family, punctuating the insult with a mocking laugh. Beside him, one of the massive hounds let out a low, guttural growl, strings of saliva dripping from its jaws. Cleanse noticed the animals looked disturbingly thin, and asked with a flat tone when the competition would actually begin. Dalton dismissed his impatience with a wave of his hand, telling his rival to watch closely. In a display of calculated cruelty, he released the pack of hungry, ferocious dogs into the woods, explaining that he had hidden bait all over the mountain to lure in wild beasts. He bragged that a starving dog's sense of smell was 100,000 times stronger than a human's, and as the hounds bolted into the brush, he raised his bow. The dogs sprinted with jaws agape, driven by primal desperation, only to be struck down by Dalton's arrows as they reached the bait, yelping in agony as the boy laughed at his own twisted success. Horrified by the senseless violence, little Erin stepped forward to defend her master's honor, but Dalton merely recognized her as the brat Cleanse always dragged around. He reached out ostensibly to pat her head, but his expression shifted into something truly sinister as he asked what a useless girl like her could possibly offer. With a sudden jerk, he grabbed Erin's arm with bruising force, pulling her toward him. Before he could do more, Cleanse's hand clamped around Dalton's wrist like a vice. His eyes ignited with a cold, predatory fury as he warned Dalton to take his hands off her, or he would snap his arm where he stood. Shocked by the raw strength in the boy's grip, Dalton tried to swing a desperate punch at Cleanse's face, but the heir dodged the blow with an agile, effortless tilt of his head. Sneering to mask his fear, Dalton leaped onto his horse and challenged Cleanse to follow him into the heart of the hunt. Cleanse mounted his own steed and ordered the commander to stay behind and protect Erin. promising to return shortly. However, the knight stood his ground, revealing a magic scroll tucked into his belt. He explained it was a signaling charm that worked by being torn, a rare tool that required no mana to activate, ensuring he could come to the boy's aid at a moment's notice. Cleanse gave a sharp nod. He knew Dalton's father was a suspicious man, and if he were to vanish into the deep woods, it would likely be part of a much darker plan than a simple game of shadows. The situation had reached a boiling point. Before spurring his horse forward, Cleanse looked back at the commander with a gaze that held far more weight than a typical teenager's, telling him to tear the scroll the moment things went south. He assured the knight that a great storm would rise in his hand if that happened, a cryptic promise that left the warrior watching in silence as the young master vanished into the shadows of the trees. Time bled away as night fell over the forest, turning the woods into a labyrinth of tangled branches and silver moonlight. Riding deep into the darkness, the former archmage mused that his rival couldn't have hidden himself too far off. Finally, he broke into a clearing and found Dalton waiting for him, a twisted silhouette against the backdrop of a massacre. Surrounded by a circle of slaughtered animals, the purple-haired boy sneered, asking why the illustrious heir had taken so long to find him. Cleanse dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the bizarre and gruesome scene. The lifeless bodies of the hunting dogs were scattered around Dalton like macabre decorations, their blood staining the dark earth. Dalton rose to his feet with a manic glint in his eye, declaring that they had finally reached the grand finale of their competition. Drawing his sword, the enemy revealed his true intentions. Cleanse himself was the final prey. He threatened to slaughter the boy and deliver the news of his tragic accident to his elder sister as a trophy. Dalton began to mock the Heinen family name, calling it a hollow, ridiculous joke of a bloodline. With a malicious grin, he signaled for his backup. Suddenly, hooded figures emerged from the darkness like ghosts, their bows drawn and aimed squarely at the white-haired boy. They cursed him for his bad luck, telling him he had simply been born into the wrong family at the wrong time. The silver-haired boy stood perfectly still, observing the ambush with a look of detached, icy boredom. Dalton continued to boast, claiming that by tomorrow, the entire continent would be gossiping about the fall of the legendary sword family, and that the young master would be nothing more than scraps for the forest scavengers. In the face of this certain death, Cleanse found his mind drifting back to Burkell's annoying, noble words about protecting the future. A small mocking smile twitched on his lips, which only served to irritate and confuse Dalton. Then, to everyone's horror, the boy began to laugh, a deep, hysterical cackle that echoed through the trees, sounding far too ancient for his small frame. Dalton recoiled, asking if the silver-haired freak had finally lost his mind. Cleanse covered his face with his hand, unable to stop laughing at the pathetic irony of the situation. When he finally looked up, his eyes were no longer human. They glowed with a piercing blood-red light. He addressed Dalton as a cheeky brat, his voice dripping with a newfound authority. The purple-haired boy froze, sweat pouring down his face as a primal terror took root in his soul. Cleanse's voice grew cold as he reminded them that this family had been built upon the foundation of his own death, and he would not allow such insects to profane it. A violent, shadowy blue aura exploded from his body, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Dalton screamed, assuming it was some hidden magic, but Cleanse corrected him with a wicked grin. This wasn't magic. It was pure demonic energy, the raw essence of the necromancer of old. The henchmen panicked, their weapons trembling as they whispered in terror, wondering what kind of monster they had truly cornered. High above the ground, suspended by his own dark power, Cleanse reached into the void of history, summoning the ancient, buried evil spirits to rise and act. In his name once more, the dark energy twisted and coiled as the former Archmage commanded his creations to devour everything in sight. From the depths of the shadows, a colossal skeleton emerged, its towering frame looming over the battlefield as Cleanse ordered the creature to consume all that stood before it. Dalton let out a panicked scream, refusing to believe his eyes as he recognized the terrifying army of the undead from the legends of Ashimon, the ancient demon king. With a chilling, predatory smile, the protagonist pointed a finger at his foes, sealing their fate. In a sudden rush of memory, he recalled how he once thought he had forgotten the man he used to be, but he had spent 200 long, agonizing years alone, nestled within a mountain of bones and skulls. It had been an eternal cycle of days spent in total darkness, where the only thing he could feel was the persistent echo of the dead calling out to him from the bottom of the abyss. That resonance was a nostalgia he could never truly escape. It was the sensory anchor that reminded him of his true identity. Back in the present, the air grew thick and heavy as massive, dark clouds choked the moonlight from the sky. Dalton continued to shriek that this couldn't be real, chanting the forbidden name of the Archmage in a fit of terror. Cleanse simply smiled, confirming that yes, that was indeed the name the world used to tremble at. The henchmen, initially paralyzed, began to murmur amongst themselves, questioning if the tales of the Demon King were actually just myths. They watched as the giant skeletons stood their ground, their eye sockets igniting with a fierce, blood-red light that pierced the gloom. However, the mercenaries soon found their courage again, erupting into mocking laughter. They called the skeletons trash, boasting that they had dismantled hundreds of such undead creatures on previous missions. One mercenary even joked about taking a bone home as a souvenir, while their leader barked orders to clear the path and eliminate the boy standing at the center of the storm. A man stepped forward, hoisting a massive, heavy crossbow and aiming it directly at the silver-haired youth. With a sharp command to fire, a rain of arrows and bolts whistled through the air, arching across the dark sky toward the protagonist and his undead legion. The projectile storm closed in with lethal speed, reflecting in Cleanse's eyes as they approached to pierce his flesh. But just as the first arrow should have struck home, the entire volley froze in midair, as if colliding with an impenetrable invisible wall. Dalton let out a triumphant shout, convinced that the air had been turned into a pincushion by the barrage. His celebration was short-lived, however. As the dust settled, he gasped in horror to see Cleanse standing completely unscathed. Massive, spectral shields had manifested magically in front of the skeletons, catching every single arrow. The army of the dead remained unmoving and perfect, a silent wall of bone and magic that stood ready to turn the hunters into the hunted. The skeletons now stood formidable, equipped with heavy shields that had manifested to blunt any further assault. Cleanse gazed at his foes with a mixture of pity and disdain, musing aloud that 200 years was a long time, long enough for the world to forget the true terror of his legions. The henchmen spiraled into a panic, their eyes bulging at the sight of shields appearing out of thin air in the bony hands of the monsters. The heir explained with a chilling calm that while common skeletons might be fragile, his were forged of a different caliber entirely. With a confident, razor-sharp smile, he declared that his undead were unlike anything they had ever faced. This revelation, paired with the boy's absolute composure, sent Dalton deeper into a state of paralyzing dread. Cleanse then issued a cold command to his first unit. Break their formation, advance. He vowed to crush with his own hands those who dared to mock the future of the North, and with that final word, he sent his troops forward with overwhelming force. The giant skeletons surged across the clearing at a speed that defied their skeletal frames, catching the mercenaries completely off guard. The enemies gasped, wondering how mindless piles of bone could move with such predatory agility. With a silent, bone-chilling battle cry that echoed in the minds of the living, the army of the dead plunged into the fray. The mercenary leader screamed for his men to hold the line and suppress their panic, but his orders were drowned out by the sounds of violence. One of his subordinates was brutally struck by a skeleton, his body broken as he was sent flying. The massacre began in earnest. The woods were filled with the screams of dying men and the rhythmic clatter of bone. Dalton watched, horrified, as the battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse of his own making. Without missing a beat, the young mage ordered his second unit, the crossbowmen, to sweep the area and eliminate the stragglers. High in the gnarled branches of the surrounding trees, skeletal archers shifted into position, their hollow sockets locked onto their targets with unnatural precision. The surviving mercenaries felt their blood run cold as they realized the undead possessed long-range capabilities. With a dry, direct command, the former archmage ordered them to fire without mercy. A volley of lethal arrows whistled through the dark air at incredible speeds. The mercenaries were struck down where they stood, the force of the bolts pinning them to the earth as they cried out in agony. One particularly resilient mercenary leader tried to fight back, parrying the heavy blow of a skeleton with his sword. In his desperation, he shouted that this was impossible, that no mere necromancer could command such coordinated power. He realized that if the battle continued this way, every single one of them would be utterly annihilated. Dalton, seeing his world crumbling around him, screamed for his men to listen, but his voice was lost in the chaos of the carnage. A skeleton crept up behind him, its jagged blade raised for a killing blow. Snarling in a fit of panicked rage, the purple-haired noble spun around and delivered a precise, powerful strike that severed the creature's head. For a fleeting second he celebrated, thinking he had found the weakness of the monsters by targeting the skull. However, his triumph turned to ash as the headless body of the skeleton didn't fall. Instead, it continued its advance, swinging its weapon back at him with unrelenting force. Dalton recoiled in terror, realizing that the rules of life and death he knew did not apply to the puppets of the Archmage. The villain stood frozen in a state of absolute disbelief, his mind screaming that a common skeleton should never be able to function without its skull. With a slow, mocking smile, the protagonist reminded him that he had already been warned. As the headless monster stood back up, it reached down, calmly retrieved its own skull from the dirt, and snapped it back onto its neck as if adjusting a piece of armor. Cleanse explained that this unyielding resilience was the primary reason he had been able to sweep across the entire continent in his past life. The sight of the creature self-repairing with its own hands sent Dalton spiraling into a primal terror. The former Archmage revealed the dark truth. Spirits summoned with pure demonic energy do not abide by the laws of mortal injury. They do not die easily. The surviving mercenaries were pushed past the brink of madness, wailing in despair as they realized they were fighting a war against an army that simply refused to stay down. Cleanse sighed, noting that with his current youthful body, he could only maintain 11 of these elite summons at a time, before asking the trembling men if they truly wished to continue this farce. While the forest was being painted in blood, the scene shifted back to the peaceful gardens of the mansion, where the commander and the little maid, Aaron, were sharing a laugh by the fountain. Aaron giggled, imagining the stories of the young master's supposed misbehavior at the monastery. The commander watched her with a softened expression, noting how much she seemed to genuinely adore the boy. With her cheeks stuffed with treats, she nodded enthusiastically, declaring that she loved him more than anything. She asked the knight if he truly understood how incredible the young master was, describing him as the personification of kindness. Her words created a haunting contrast. As she called him gentle, a mercenary was currently sprinting through the dark woods, shrieking in fear. As she called him sweet, a skeleton was cleaving through a henchman with a blade of dark magic. She smiled brightly, claiming he was the warmest soul in the world because he shared his biscuits with her, while at that very moment a cold, shadowy aura of death was suffocating the life out of the forest. Back in the thick of the carnage, the protagonist's gaze remained like chips of ice, devoid of the warmth Aaron so fondly described. One of the mercenaries let out a final, gurgling cry as a skeleton ended him, leaving only the purple-haired Dalton to defend himself. He was panting heavily, his muscles screaming with exhaustion as he swung his blade in a frantic arc. He managed to land a heavy blow, but the skeleton's bones knit back together instantly, leaving him in a state of utter hopelessness. In a fit of desperate rage, Dalton realized that hacking at the puppets was a fool's errand. He concluded that the only way to stop the nightmare was to kill the puppeteer. If he could strike down the young master, the summons would surely vanish. With a roar of hatred, Dalton charged toward Cleanse, screaming his name. He declared that the macabre game of playing with corpses ended now, and that everything would be settled by the mage's death. He raised his sword for a final, overhead executioner's strike, pouring every ounce of his remaining strength into the blow. But Cleanse didn't flinch. His eyes suddenly ignited with a brilliant purple light, his magical sight predicting the trajectory of the attack with crystalline clarity. To the ancient necromancer, the deadly lunge was moving in slow motion, a pathetic attempt from a child who didn't yet understand that he was challenging a god of the afterlife. Purple energy crackled within Cleanse's eyes, the violent sparks illuminating the darkness as he tracked every micro-movement of his opponent through his mystical sight. The archives of his memory opened, pulling forth a technique he had witnessed only once. He recalled with absolute precision the trajectory and the rhythm of the swordplay his brother had displayed days ago in the arena. Dalton's eyes widened in paralyzing shock as he recognized the stance. It was the sacred secret art of the Heinen family. Cleanse unleashed the devastating meteor sword technique, his blade becoming a streak of falling light that collided with Dalton's weapon. With a sickening metallic snap, Dalton's sword was sheared in half, the broken steel spinning into the dirt. Standing over his trembling foe, Cleanse's voice dropped to a glacial whisper, informing him that his true punishment was only just beginning. As the dust of the skirmish began to settle and the night air grew unnervingly still, Cleanse looked down at the defeated noble and conceded that Dalton had been right about one thing. If a summoner dies, his creations lose their power. Even the great Ashimon had never managed to overcome that fundamental flaw. However, the former archmage reflected on a new irony. While his past self relied solely on demonic energy, it was the martial prowess of the Heinen bloodline that now fortified his weaknesses. The very blood of his ancient enemy, running through his current veins, had made him something far more dangerous than he had ever been before. Dalton, broken and confused, stammered a question, but he found his limbs unresponsive, his body a leaden weight upon the earth. Cleanse met his gaze with a look of absolute domesticity and supreme contempt, watching the light fade from the boy's eyes. With a final breath, Dalton collapsed, and Cleanse looked toward the horizon, whispering to the ghost of Berkel that he should wait, for he intended to rebuild this ruined house with his own two hands. Suddenly, Dalton jolted awake, but the forest was gone. He found himself submerged in a suffocating absolute darkness. He tried to move his hands, but they were anchored by the cold, heavy bite of thick iron shackles. Panic flared in his chest as he realized he was bound to a torture chair, its frame lined with cruel spikes and rusted chains. A shadowy figure emerged from the void, noting with a dry tone that the guest had finally awakened. It was Cleanse, though he seemed transformed in this space. He revealed that they were in the place where souls are dragged after their light. Goes out, a personal afterlife, crafted by the will of Ashimon. Dalton's mind fractured at the realization that he was dead, trapped in a dimension of the necromancer's making. Cleanse leaned in, his voice echoing with the weight of centuries. He reminded Dalton of his hobby, of the countless dogs he had starved and slaughtered, for the sheer sport of it, and the atrocities he had committed under the mask of noble tradition. The mage recalled the look of twisted joy on Dalton's face during those hunts, a memory that now served as the blueprint for his suffering. Dalton shrieked, demanding to be released, but his cries were swallowed by the abyss. A moment of clarity struck the villain. He remembered the feeling of Cleanse's sword piercing him, yet here he sat, seemingly whole. Cleanse clarified the nightmare. Dalton was indeed dead, and this wellness was merely a vessel for his karma. Whether the boy believed in the soul or the afterlife no longer mattered. The debt was due, and the hour had finally come, for him to pay for every drop of blood he had ever spilled. Past sins had finally come to collect their due. Dalton's breath, hitched in a ragged sob as a phantom pack of hounds, materialized from the void behind the protagonist. Cleanse commanded his enemy to listen, really. Listen to the cacophony of barks and snarls from the lives he had snuffed out. For mere entertainment, the ghost dogs lunged, their spectral jaws sinking into the villain's soul. He shrieked in a despair so profound it felt like his very essence was being shredded. The silver-haired boy stood over him, cold and unyielding, telling him to memorize this agony, for this was the hell he had built with his own hands. Dalton's pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears as he was ravaged by the victims of his own blood sport. Back in the physical world, Dalton's lifeless body lay sprawled in the dirt, covered in wounds that mirrored the spiritual assault. Cleanse sheathed his blade, his expression serene, having finally purged the nuisance that dared to humiliate him. His skeletal legion gathered behind him, standing in silent, loyal rows. Looking at the hollow sockets of his servants, the young mage felt a flicker of ancient debt. He told his creatures that they deserved a reward for answering his call across the centuries, promising to break the curse of their eternal servitude. A brilliant emerald light washed over the clearing, and the skeletons began to dissolve into shimmering particles of mana. Cleanse watched in a heavy silence as they faded into the wind, reflecting on the cyclical nature of existence. He wondered once more why he had been pulled back from the void. In his philosophy, true death was when bones turned to dust and scattered without a trace. Yet here he was, flesh and blood once more. His introspection was cut short when a hooded figure stepped out from the tree line, admitting his surprise at seeing someone so young wielding the forbidden art of necromancy. Cleanse's eyes narrowed as he questioned the stranger's identity and how much he had witnessed. The man offered a cryptic, mocking smile, stating there was no need for names. With a flick of his wrist, a sickly green aura flared in his palm, and he began to weave a spell of his own. He claimed the boy wouldn't understand the scope of his mission, even if he explained it. And before Cleanse's eyes, the dead mercenaries began to twitch and rise. Their eyes glowed with a stagnant green light, turning into mindless marionettes under the stranger's thrall. The hooded man hoisted the corpses with his dark magic, noting that while Dalton had been a pathetic failure, his leftovers were still quite useful. With a final, chilling laugh, the necromancer vanished into the mist. Taking the reanimated bodies with him, miles away at the mansion, the peaceful atmosphere had begun to sour. Aaron, the small maid, tried to coax the commander into listening to more stories about the young master's antics, but the knight remained frozen, staring at the emergency scroll in his hand with growing dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong. It had been 3 hours since the signal started to feel off, and his instincts were screaming of a trap. He moved to leave the estate to find Cleanse, but his path was suddenly barred by 2 grim-faced castle guards. The tension in the air snapped like a bowstring as the commander realized the conspiracy against the young heir went far deeper than a simple hunting trip. The guards at the mansion blocked the way with cold, impassive faces, stating that it would be a severe problem if the commander were to abandon his post now. The knight stood in a heavy silence, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the crest of the Corwell, family emblazoned on their uniforms. It was the confirmation he needed. Dalton's family had been weaving this web of betrayal from the very start, preparing for the worst. The commander drew himself up to his full height and issued a final warning. He would no longer stand idle if they attempted to bar his path again. Intimidated by his overwhelming killing intent, the Corwell guards hesitated. The knight turned to Erin, the young maid, and told her to retreat to the safety of the manor with the priest, who had accompanied them on the trip. However, one of the guards informed him with a grim expression that the priest had already departed long ago. Recalling Cleanse's earlier warnings and sensing the dire urgency of the moment, the commander vaulted onto his horse. With the emergency scroll clenched between his teeth, he tore it asunder, certain that these events were no mere coincidence. He spurred his steed into a gallop, racing toward the forest as fast as the animal's legs would carry him, fearing what might have already befallen his master. Deep within the dark woods, the young protagonist stood his ground against the mysterious necromancer's legion of the walking dead. Beads of sweat rolled down his pale face as he realized his demonic energy had been nearly depleted in the previous struggle. His current youthful body was at its limit, and he could no longer call upon his own necromancy to defend himself. The hooded sorcerer, sensing victory, ordered his mindless zombies to swarm the boy without mercy. The undead horde lunged forward, but Cleanse simply smirked, mocking the necromancer for thinking he could win merely by mimicking the arts of the past. Suddenly, the crest on the magic scroll in Cleanse's hand erupted with a blinding, celestial radiance. The encroaching zombies shrieked and recoiled, their rotted flesh contorting in agony as the holy light seared through the gloom. Cleanse laughed, taunting his foe with the news that he was now utterly finished. As the necromancer watched in confusion, the ground beneath them began to pulse with a golden, divine power that surged upward, consuming the shadows. From the heart of the radiance, the priest who had been traveling with the young heir appeared, his eyes burning with a fierce golden fire. With a voice like rolling thunder, he invoked the light to purify the abominations before him, turning the zombies into nothing more than drifting ash. He assured the young master that he could rest easy now, for the church would handle the rest. The stunned necromancer demanded to know the identity of this newcomer, who wielded such overwhelming holy force. The priest met his gaze with a look of absolute determination and introduced himself as an exarch of the Holy Order. Exarchs were the Church's supreme human weapons, 3 chosen warriors who swore to execute the absolute will of the Pope. They were the only ones capable of wielding the holy weapons left behind by Saint Galagund, and it was whispered that a single exarch possessed the martial power of an entire fortress. The necromancer trembled as the priest's holy aura began to physically crush the darkness he had conjured. Cleanse watched as the man he knew only as a simple priest revealed his true status as the strongest in martial prowess among the chosen 3. The exarch stepped forward, shielding the boy and promising to guard him against all evil. The remaining zombies, driven by the necromancer's frantic commands, snarled and lunged with savage fury, but they were no match for the divine light. The exarch raised a sacred tome, channeling his power into a baptism of fire that incinerated the undead where they stood. He commanded the sinners to listen and pray for their souls. Before it was too late, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment, with a powerful stomp of his foot, a shockwave of golden energy rippled through the earth, shattering the ground and hurling the undead puppets away like leaves in a storm, delivering a final crushing blow. The exarch declared this act to be his mercy, a final judgment for lost and corrupted souls. The necromancer was sent flying by the sheer pressure of the attack, his mind reeling at the insanity of an exarch appearing in such a remote place. He spat a curse into the wind, realizing that his carefully laid plan had just collided with the most terrifying force the Holy Order had to offer. The hooded necromancer spat at the ground, his voice cracking, as he complained that such divine power was nothing more than a grand lie. Terrified, he turned to flee the clearing. But in his frantic escape, his mask slipped and fell to the forest floor, exposing his secret identity to the moonlight. He didn't get far. The exarch materialized in his path like a vengeful god, asking with a terrifyingly calm voice just where he thought he was going. The necromancer shrieked as the priest's mental pressure invaded his very mind, crushing his will. Gasping for air that wouldn't come, the sorcerer listened as the priest whispered that the prayer wasn't over yet, that he should be grateful for the judgment the divine light was about to bestow upon him. In the name of the Holy Order, the exarch delivered a final, purifying strike that reduced the man to a pile of gray ash. Cleanse watched the execution with rapt attention, noticing one of the necromancer's eyes roll across the dirt until it stopped at his feet. As he leaned down to pick it up, he reflected on the exarch's terrifying efficiency. With a single step and the mere pressure of his presence, the priest had obliterated over 20 bodies instantly. The sheer, overwhelming scale of that strength left even the former archmage deeply impressed. Suddenly, a blood-stained hand clamped onto Cleanse's shoulder with bruising force. It was the exarch. His eyes narrowed as he looked the boy up and down. He remarked that he had rushed to this location the moment he sensed a surge of necromancy. But now that he was standing here, something felt incredibly strange. The priest's grip tightened as he noted that the aura of death he had detected didn't seem to belong to the boy, yet it had come from this exact spot. His gaze turned suspicious, sharp enough to cut, and Cleanse felt a wave of tension wash over him. He knew he was standing on the edge of a precipice. He realized that if he made even one wrong move or said the wrong word, this holy man would eliminate him right then and there without a shred of hesitation. The standoff was broken by the sound of thundering hooves as the commander arrived, shouting Cleanse's name in a state of high alarm. Seeing his guard appear so quickly brought a flicker of relief to the protagonist. But the toll of the night had finally reached its peak, the strain of channeling even a fraction of his old necromancy was too much for his current fragile body. As his legs buckled and the world began to tilt, the commander leaped from his horse, catching his young master before he hit the ground. Desperate and worried, the knight asked what had happened, only for the boy to whisper that his strength had simply vanished. When asked about the fate of the hunting party, Cleanse confirmed coldly that he had eliminated Dalton in the heat of battle. Nearby, a single white flower, now splattered with droplets of crimson blood, swayed gently in the silent, dark wind of the forest. The scene shifted back to the mansion, where a heated inquiry was underway. The news of Dalton's death had struck like a thunderbolt, and Count Delkin Cornwell, Dalton's father, slammed his fists onto the table in a blind rage. He refused to believe that his son, a man he praised for his knightly honor and loyalty, would ever try to assassinate the ducal heir. An investigator intervened, showing the Count a document that proved 20 of his own mercenaries were present at the scene. The Count's face paled as he realized his men had been caught, but he quickly pivoted to a new defense. He argued that it made no sense. Dalton was a trained warrior, and everyone knew Cleanse had no mana and couldn't fight to save his life. Desperate to save his reputation, the Count began to attack Cleanse's character, bringing up the bizarre rumors surrounding the boy's late mother. He accused the boy of hiring an assassin to kill Dalton and then framing him for the crime. Just as the Count's accusations reached a fever pitch, a powerful, commanding voice rang out from the entrance, telling him to shut his mouth. Cleanse walked into the room, noting with a dry smirk that there seemed to be no limit to the nonsense these men would speak. He stated clearly that he had acted in self-defense, and that the priest had assisted him against the true threat of the necromancer. When the Count called him a liar, Cleanse met his gaze with an iron-willed stare, his eyes flashing with a faint, mocking pink light. With a razor-thin, ironic smile, he asked if his being Ashimon was now an established fact in their minds. The Count felt a sudden, suffocating pressure as the protagonist reminded everyone of the vow he made the moment he ended Dalton's life. A solemn oath to rebuild the crumbling foundations of the Heinen family with his own hands. The boy's voice carried a chilling conviction. He declared that he would rebuild the family with his own hands and would not allow any more vermin to obstruct his path. The heavy tension in the room was suddenly broken by a sharp knock at the door. A blonde woman entered, her presence so commanding that the air seemed to still around her. This was the commander of the Blue Spear Holy Knights, and her arrival immediately sent a ripple of unease through the assembly. Cleanse recognized her instantly. She had been present at the sword exhibition, watching from the shadows. When a noble questioned her right to be there, the investigator clarified that Dalton had a long history of performing missions for her order, giving her a vested interest in the truth. She fixed Cleanse with a piercing, analytical stare that made the ancient mage within him instinctively wary. Without wasting time, the commander requested a private audience with the young master. Though the investigator hesitated, he ultimately allowed it, warning the boy not to be long. As Cleanse followed her toward a secluded room, his mind raced through the possibilities. He knew this wasn't a social call. It was either a suspicious confirmation or a dangerous test. He resolved to use her family, the House of Forrivern, as a stepping stone for his own grand designs, regardless of her intent. They reached a private study, and the commander turned, her calm and strangely alluring voice breaking the silence. Without warning, she pressed the boy against the wall, her eyes locking onto his as she whispered an unexpected request. She wanted to touch him to see the truth. This woman was the eldest daughter of the Forrivern House, one of the 3 legendary pillars of the continent. Cleanse recalled her fearsome reputation. Records described her in battle against savage orcs, where her blue eyes would glow with a lethal intensity as she danced through the fray with her spear. She was a living legend who had single-handedly annihilated high-level monster orders, standing alone amidst piles of corpses as the undisputed protector of the civilians. Back in the present, her intimidating aura remained, even as she teased him. When Cleanse hesitated, she snapped at him to stop pretending they were close. Despite their distant family connection, she reminded him that since she was the daughter of a first wife and he was from a different branch, they shared no true blood, meaning she felt no familial obligation to hold back her personal curiosity. The commander shoved him against the wall once more, her grip firm as she demanded to see his hands. Cleanse shouted in confusion, asking what she was playing at, but she ignored his protests. She took his hand in hers, feeling his skin with a delicate yet firm touch. She noted aloud that his hands were as soft as a baby's, completely devoid of the calluses or scars that define a true swordsman. Her fingers slid over his tendons with clinical precision as she leaned in, close, her breath warm against his face. She looked him in the eyes and asked the million-dollar question. If his hands showed no signs of sword mastery, what other power had he used to slaughter Dalton and 20 hardened mercenaries? Cleanse shoved her away, retreating a few steps as a cold sweat broke out on his neck. He realized this woman was far more dangerous than the priests. She wasn't looking for a confession, she was looking for a reaction. He knew that in her world, silence was an admission and hesitation was a confirmation. Deciding to go on the offensive, he flashed a mocking smile and asked her directly what she would do if he truly were the legendary archmage Ashimon. To his absolute shock, she burst into laughter. She looked him up and down and told him that a little pipsqueak like him could never be the terrifying demon king of old. The insult hit Cleanse harder than any physical blow. He stood there paralyzed and gaping, repeating the word pipsqueak to himself in utter disbelief that he, the most feared necromancer in history, had just been called short. He asked if she hadn't perhaps made a mistake, but her mocking grin remained unchanged. She confirmed it without a second thought, even offering to repeat herself. She called him Pipsqueak once more, and Cleanse felt his temper flare at the sheer humiliation. Deep down, he knew her assessment of his stature was technically correct, but the emotional damage was done, and his dignity as the former Demon King was thoroughly shaken. To make matters more absurd, the commander made a bold, unexpected proposal. If he could defeat a knight without using a sword or his necromancy, she would kiss him. Cleanse was left speechless, his mind reeling from the audacity of the offer. Between his internal injuries and the surreal nature of the conversation, he struggled to judge the situation rationally, wondering if this was some convoluted political tactic or a bizarre bribe. She looked out toward the horizon, noting that it was getting late and she needed to return to the meeting. She added almost as a challenge that the legendary archman would never have been as reckless or as bold as the boy standing before her. As they re-entered the meeting hall, every eye turned toward them with burning curiosity. Cleanse admitted to himself that he had been too complacent, underestimating the political quagmire he had jumped into. He knew the nobles would never truly believe. A mannerless boy had acted in self-defense against the Count's son. When the investigator pressed for details on their private discussion, the protagonist ignored the question and strode toward, a sword leaning against the wall. He gripped the hilt and drove the blade into the floor with a violent thud, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Shocked by the sudden outburst, the assembly watched in silence as the boy turned to face Count Cornwell. He challenged the Count to prove his accusations right then and there. To settle the matter of his innocence once and for all, Cleanse invoked the ancient northern tradition of trial by combat, a lawless duel, where the victor is declared innocent and the loser is proven guilty. The Count was stunned, wondering if the boy had finally lost his mind. Trial by combat was a brutal relic of the past with no restrictions. But the Count quickly saw a golden opportunity. If he could move the dispute from the courtroom to the arena, he could bury the evidence of his mercenaries along with the boy. He accepted the challenge with a predatory smile, announcing he would appoint a champion to fight in his stead, and swearing to end the boy's life. Cleanse simply smiled back unbothered, declaring that he would be the one to finish the Count's line. With the duel set for 4 days' time, Cleanse knew this was only the beginning. He intended to use the Count as a stepping stone to show every bastard in the family exactly who he was, planning to tear the house down and rebuild it in his own image. In a private wing of the mansion, Cleanse's older half-brother Delin erupted in fury. He screamed that the challenge was absolute madness, questioning if Cleanse understood that he was gambling with his life. Cleanse, exhausted by the lecturing, told him he was well aware and tired of hearing it. Delin mentioned that their father had already granted permission for the duel, but he desperately offered to take Cleanse's place as champion. Cleanse refused instantly. Delin argued that as the future ruler of the North, it was his duty to protect his younger brother. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Delin recalled the first time he saw Cleanse as a baby. To him, the infant had looked like a beautiful angel, and he had spent 7 years waiting for his return from the monastery. With tears in his eyes, Delin grabbed Cleanse and begged him to reconsider, desperate to prevent his brother's certain death. Their emotional confrontation was interrupted by a guard, who arrived with urgent news. Count Cornwell had already chosen his champion. Cleanse pulled away from his brother's grip, his voice cold and focused as he asked who they would be facing. The guard revealed the name Randall, an excommunicated knight who had built a terrifying reputation on the battlefield. The scene shifted to a grimy tavern where the doors swung open to reveal a massive, muscular man with a gaze of pure, unbridled savagery. Randall had been cast out of the knightly orders because of his uncontrollable, violent urge to slaughter everyone around him. He sat amidst a wreckage of broken furniture and fallen bodies, drinking a blood-red liquor directly from a wooden bucket, with a monstrous expression of fury. He muttered that it had been a long time since he had heard a young boy scream, his anticipation for the slaughter palpable. Back at the manor, Cleanse listened to the description of his opponent, his eyes growing serious and filled with a grim, unwavering determination. Just then, a man approached Cleanse while carrying a sword wrapped carefully in cloth. Handing it over, he spoke in a serious tone. "Here is the sword you requested. I forged it exactly the way you asked. But please be careful with it. The moment it clashes against a mana-infused sword, it will shatter instantly." Cleanse quietly took the sword into his hands and inspected it, for a moment before replying without hesitation. "Good. Then let's head out right away." At the same time, excitement had already spread throughout the entire arena. Every person gathered. There was talking about the same thing and the fact that Cleanse had finally decided to appear in person. The atmosphere buzzed with curiosity and anticipation as countless eyes turned toward the battlefield. The scene then shifted toward the nobles seated high above the arena. One of them looked toward Cleanse's father and said with visible surprise, "To think you'd actually come out in person." Then turning slightly toward him again, he continued with a faint smile, "But are you truly okay with this? My champion is a knight from the Empire. He might be quite a handful for your manaless son. It's still not too late to send out Lord Delane instead, don't you think? However, Cleanse's father showed absolutely no reaction to those words. His expression remained calm and unmoved, as if he had already made up his mind long ago. Meanwhile, Cleanse continued walking toward the arena, his eyes scanning the surroundings as thoughts ran through his head. Anyway, where is he? My opponent? Hasn't he come out yet? But the very next moment, an enormous shadow suddenly loomed over him. A massive man with the build of a monster stepped forward. His body looked like solid steel, muscles bulging beneath his clothes like a true warrior forged for battle. Slowly, he placed one heavy hand on top of Cleanse's head and looked down at him with an intimidating grin before speaking. So, you are Lord Cleanse? The narration then revealed the identity of the terrifying man standing before him. He was none other than Conwell's champion, Randall. Randall looked down at Cleanse with a cruel grin, stretched across his face before speaking in a mocking voice. You're much younger than I'd heard. Good, those arms of yours are so thin. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he leaned closer. I wonder what kind of sound you'll make when your neck snaps. The instant Cleanse understood what was happening, he jumped backward at incredible speed, creating distance between them in a single movement. The sudden reaction shocked the audience, and murmurs immediately spread across the arena. What was that just now? Did he just run backward? Up in the stands, the same nobleman from earlier looked toward Cleanse, father again, and spoke with amusement in his voice. Did you see that, Your Grace? He's already acting like this before the duel has even begun. Can he really handle a fight against someone like Randall? Meanwhile, Randall let out a low laugh before speaking once more. Oh dear. He already looks completely terrified. But Cleanse, while staring at him cautiously, was thinking something entirely different in his mind. It's not that. Damn, that startled me. It reminded me of when that priest grabbed my shoulder last time. I backed away without even realizing it for a second. That bastard is useless right until the very end. At that same moment, from high above the arena, Captain Laya Ren was silently watching everything unfold below. Her sharp eyes remained fixed on Cleanse as the atmosphere grew heavier with tension. Just then, one of the guards approached her in a hurry and said anxiously, Lady Helion will be furious if she finds out about this. We should head back, Captain. However, Laya answered immediately without even looking at him. I don't care. That woman isn't my mother anyway. Then, deep inside her thoughts, another idea crossed her mind. If he actually defeats that knight, I'll give him my lips. But even after thinking that, her gaze did not waver from the arena below. There's also something I need to confirm, she quietly added. Meanwhile, down in the arena, Cleanse stood there feeling the weight of everyone's attention on him. Embarrassment crept across his face as he thought to himself, This is so embarrassing. Then, trying to act calm and composed, he awkwardly spoke up while straightening himself. Well, you see, I've been suffering from a stiff neck lately, Cleanse straightened himself and spoke with clear irritation in his voice. So you'd better not touch my shoulder. But despite the warning, Randall slowly reached his hand forward once again, as if deliberately trying to provoke him. The moment Cleanse saw that, his expression twisted in annoyance and he immediately snapped back. I told you not to touch me, you perverted bastard. Are your ears stuffed with muscles too? Then again, that's exactly why the Empire abandoned you. For a brief moment, the entire arena fell silent. Then Randall's face slowly broke into a savage grin. Excellent, he said in a low voice. The fouler your mouth is, the more you'll have to scream with it later. The instant those words left his mouth, Randall grabbed forward and threw a devastating punch straight toward Cleanse. His massive fist cut through the air with monstrous force, powerful enough to crush a normal man instantly. However, at that exact moment, Cleanse calmly unbuttoned his coat, and in the very next second, boom! Randall's fist smashed directly into the ground, causing a violent explosion-like impact that shattered the stone. Beneath him, dust and debris erupted into the air as cracks spread across the arena floor. But Randall's eyes widened in surprise. The only thing left in his hand was Cleanse's coat. Cleanse himself had already disappeared from that spot before the attack could land. The audience immediately burst into chaos. The ground shattered! Just what kind of power was that? Wait, look over there. Everyone quickly turned toward the opposite side of the arena, where Cleanse could now be seen standing at a distance with a short sword in his hand. His expression remained tense as he stared at Randall carefully. That bastard has a seriously nasty temper. Then, deep inside his mind, Cleanse began analyzing the situation calmly. A direct clash is going to be difficult, just as I expected. If I take even one hit from that massive body, I'll be the one blown apart. I hate admitting it, but this isn't a situation where I can afford to take it easy. Meanwhile, the spectators continued whispering nervously among themselves as they watched the overwhelming difference in raw power between the two fighters. I think he dodged that pretty well. But how is he supposed to defeat a monster like that? Another man nearby swallowed hard before speaking in disbelief. Even a single graze from that attack would shatter his bones. Some of the spectators were still whispering among themselves. He's just walking to his death. Nearby, Cleanse's friend called out his name, and at that moment he remembered what Cleanse had said earlier. "You're going to take my place in the trial by combat?" That would only hand them a legal excuse to kill the Rainland heir. As those words echoed in his mind, he silently thought to himself, "You're right. The fate of the family is on the line, so I can't just do whatever I want." However, before that thought could even fully settle in his mind, the fight had already begun on the other side of the arena. Randall suddenly rushed forward at terrifying speed, closing the distance between them in an instant. Cleanse immediately drew his sword and launched an attack. But Randall casually stopped the blade with nothing but his bare hand. The sheer force behind it shocked everyone watching. In the very next moment, Randall struck back, forcing Cleanse to slide backward across the ground. But Randall did not give him even a second to recover. Moving with overwhelming speed, he appeared right in front of Cleanse again and continued attacking relentlessly. While mocking him, Randall sneered, "Do you think you can win just by dodging?" Cleanse was using every ounce of strength he had just to block the incoming attacks. Each strike felt heavier than the last, pushing him further and further back. Meanwhile, Randall continued to ridicule him without mercy. "Why don't you try using your necromancy? Aren't you the great Archimond?" The moment Randall looked directly into Cleanse's eyes, he noticed something strange. Cleanse was smiling, not a confident smile, nor a cheerful one, but the kind of smile that carried irritation and suppressed rage. Deep inside, Cleanse clenched his thoughts in anger. "This is annoying. Should I just use necromancy and kill them all?" After witnessing that overwhelming pressure, even Randall instinctively stepped back in fear. Sweat began pouring down his face as his body reacted before his mind could fully understand what he had just felt. The confidence and arrogance he had shown until now were starting to crack. Among the audience, confused voices immediately began to spread. What? Did Randall just dodge? No way. He must be going easy on him. But Randall himself knew that was not the truth. Inside his mind, he was struggling to understand what had just happened. What was that just now? There was definitely nothing there, but even though Cleanse had not visibly done anything, Randall could feel an intense aura of death coming from within him. It was not something he could see with his eyes, yet his instincts were screaming at him to stay away. That invisible pressure alone was enough to make fear crawl through his entire body. Seeing Randall suddenly retreat like that, the man seated above the arena clicked his tongue in irritation and shouted, "What's going on? Why is Randall acting like that?" At that moment, Cleanse calmly stepped forward and spoke clearly in front of everyone present. "Don't worry. I won't use anything like necromancy, because I am a Rhineland. This is a place to prove oneself entirely with a sword." He paused briefly before continuing in a firm voice. "Therefore, I won't use necromancy." The moment those words were spoken, shock spread throughout the entire arena. His father, his friend, and nearly everyone watching from the audience stared at him in disbelief. No one had expected him to say something like that. Until now, many people had looked at him with suspicion because of his necromancy, but hearing those words directly from Cleanse began to change the atmosphere completely. The crowd's opinions slowly started shifting. Then, little by little, people began cheering for him. "Yeah, this is what a trial by combat should be. We're with you. We'll support you." See, it wasn't just a bluff after all. The arena that had once been filled with doubt and mockery was now gradually being overtaken by excitement and support, all because of Cleanse's unwavering declaration. Randall infused even more mana into his blade, the energy around the sword growing sharper and heavier as he prepared himself for another attack. Staring directly at Cleanse, he muttered with confidence, "That brat has no mana." It was then explained why the Imperial swordsmanship style was feared across the Empire. The true strength of Imperial swordsmanship lay in never holding back one's mana, by pushing every sense to its absolute limit. Breathing, muscles, blood flow, and reflexes. A swordsman could unleash a single burst of explosive power capable of hunting down an opponent in an instant. Randall gathered all of his strength into one devastating strike and rushed forward at incredible speed. His entire focus was on ending the fight with a single attack. But at that exact moment, Cleanse calmly dodged. As he watched Randall's movements, Cleanse quietly said, "I can see it. His technique, mana capacity, even the arc of his blade. Every last bit of it." To Cleanse, Randall's attacks had started to look painfully obvious. Like a damn fly. Hearing those words only fueled Randall's anger further. Once again, he gathered every ounce of his strength into another attack, this time even more powerful than before. The force behind it was nearly double the previous strike. The moment the attack landed, a massive explosion erupted across the arena. Dust and mist spread everywhere, swallowing the battlefield and blocking everyone's vision. The audience could barely see anything through the cloud created by the impact. Randall's eyes widened in disbelief. Did he actually read every trajectory of my sword in that short a time? Then suddenly, from behind him, Cleanse appeared. Moving through the smoke without a sound, Cleanse stepped directly into Randall's blind spot and prepared his counterattack. With a body that size, your back is completely exposed. The next instant, Cleanse struck. His timing was flawless. The precision and smoothness of his technique were so incredible that everyone watching was left completely stunned. Even the experienced warriors in the arena could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. Meanwhile, inside his mind, Randall was in total confusion. This makes no sense. This bastard, he doesn't have any mana, so how the hell? Not far away, one of the soldiers standing beside Laya Ren spoke in disbelief. Did you just see that, Captain? At that moment, Laya Ren herself was blushing slightly as she watched Clean's fight. Clearly affected by the overwhelming skill and confidence he was displaying before everyone. After that, the scene shifted to another place, where a heavy silence filled the room. In the middle of it, a voice could be heard speaking calmly yet filled with frustration. Normally, I would have stepped in myself. Before anyone else could react, another man quickly answered, "Your Grace, that's—" But his words were cut short by the protagonist's father. "I know," he said in a low voice. "I shouldn't act on personal feelings. If I step forward now, the prestige of the Rhineland family will only fall even further." His expression grew darker as he continued. "But the opponent is a knight from the Empire. Cleanse has absolutely no chance of winning." The other man looked troubled after hearing that and asked carefully, "Then why did you permit the duel?" For a moment, the protagonist's father stayed silent, as if carrying years of regret inside his heart. Then he finally spoke. He stepped forward to defend the honor of his late mother. His voice was heavy with guilt. "Even when he was falsely branded as Archimon and locked away in the monastery, I couldn't save him." His fists tightened slowly. "So what right do I have to stop him now?" The atmosphere became even heavier. "In the end," he continued bitterly, "I can't protect anything. Not my child, not my family." Hearing those painful words, the other man immediately tried to reassure him. "You don't need to worry. Your Grace, young master doesn't fight losing battles." Right after that, the scene returned to the present battlefield. The duel was still ongoing. Yet even Cleanse's father could not hide the shock in his eyes after witnessing what was happening before him. At the same time, the narration began to explain the history and nature of the Rhineland family. The Rhineland family was known as the Northern Swordsmanship family. In order to survive the merciless frozen lands of the North, they developed a sword style that reduced mana consumption to the absolute minimum. Every movement was refined for efficiency, conserving strength and mana so they could endure long battles within the brutal icy fields. On the other hand, Imperial swordsmanship was completely different. Imperial swordsmanship was predation itself. Imperial swordsmanship was a style built entirely around domination, overwhelming the opponent by unleashing an enormous amount of mana all at once and crushing them before they could react. In contrast, Rhineland swordsmanship followed a completely different philosophy. It focused on patience, precision, and striking only at the perfect opening while using the smallest amount of mana possible. That was the true essence of the Rhineland family's techniques. The ultimate swordsmanship that achieved maximum efficiency with minimal mana. As the realization spread across the battlefield, Cleanse spoke calmly while facing Randall directly. "This is how I, someone without mana, can still wield my family's techniques." His eyes remained steady despite the pressure pouring from his opponent. "It might lack power, but it's more than enough to beat down a guy like you." The moment those words reached him, Randall's expression twisted with rage. Veins bulged across his face as he glared at Cleanse furiously. "You little rat!" At the same time, an overwhelming amount of power suddenly began gathering throughout Randall's entire body. Mana surged violently around him, growing denser and heavier every second. It was clear that he was preparing to release every ounce of mana he possessed in a single devastating attack. From above, the man watching the duel noticed the change instantly. His eyes widened as he thought to himself, "There it is. Randall's secret technique. A mana burst that instantly seals the opponent's movements." The pressure on the battlefield kept increasing non-stop. The air itself felt heavier as Randall's power continued to rise higher and higher. Then, with a furious roar, Randall shouted, "Don't make me laugh, you bastard! I'm the one who will win." In the very next moment, he exploded forward at terrifying speed and closed the distance between himself and Cleanse almost instantly. His attack came crashing down with monstrous force, powerful enough to crush his opponent in a single strike. But at the last possible second, Cleanse reacted. Without panic, he moved his sword with perfect timing and blocked Randall's attack head-on. But there was one thing everyone still remembered about that sword. The warning that had been given earlier at the very beginning of the duel. The moment it clashes with a mana-infused sword, it will shatter. And exactly as predicted, the instant Cleanse blocked Randall's mana-filled attack. Cracks spread across the blade before it completely broke apart. Pieces of the shattered sword scattered through the air. Seeing that, Randall immediately smirked victoriously. "Serves you right. With this, your sword is—" But before he could even finish his sentence, Cleanse suddenly smiled. "Yeah," he said calmly. "Now it's finally complete. The weapon to hunt you." For a brief moment, Randall could not understand what he meant. Then it happened. Cleanse moved forward in an instant. Instead of treating the shattered weapon as useless, he used the broken blade itself like a short, mana blade designed for close-range combat. Before Randall could properly react, Clens stepped directly into his range and slashed at point-blank distance. A sharp strike flashed through the battlefield. Randall's arm was cut clean off. The severed arm flew through the air as blood scattered everywhere, and Randall's expression twisted into complete shock and agony. He let out a horrifying scream as he collapsed backward. At that moment, someone loudly declared, "The duel is over!" Meanwhile, among the people watching the fight, one man stared at the battlefield in disbelief while thinking to himself, just as the young master said, Rhineland swordsmanship can be performed with minimal mana, but that should only be possible for a seasoned knight. Yet he flawlessly executed everything, from the footwork to the path of the sword. And on top of that, he deliberately baited his opponent into breaking his sword, so he could strike from point-blank range. The man could barely believe what he had witnessed, no matter how you look at it. This is the young master's perfect victory. On the battlefield, Randall continued screaming loudly in pain after losing his arm. Immediately, a group of healers rushed forward toward him in panic. "Hurry up and stop the bleeding. Quickly, hold his arm down, cast sleep magic." The entire area became chaotic as the healers desperately tried to stabilize him. Meanwhile, Clens calmly watched the scene before asking, "Can that be reattached?" However, despite his calm voice, he actually looked visibly disappointed. After hearing the severity of the injury, the healers quickly responded, "No, it only needs basic healing magic. We'll have to prepare a prosthetic arm." Hearing that answer, Clens simply replied, "Oh, really? Is that all?" At the same time, deep inside his mind, he quietly thought to himself, even after 200 years, healing magic hasn't advanced much at all. Then, from the other side, his father called out to him with a serious expression. "You feel nothing after seeing a severed limb?" The moment Clens heard those words, his expression slightly changed. "Right? I'm not Archimond right now," he reminded himself internally. After that, Clens quietly began walking away from the scene as if everything had already ended. While moving forward calmly, he thought to himself, should I pretend to be scared now? At that very moment, the true mastermind behind the entire incident finally stepped forward. His face was filled with disbelief and anger as he shouted, "This makes no sense! For Randall to lose? Do you even know how much money I spent to hire that knight?" Before he could continue raging any further, Clens's father suddenly spoke from behind in a cold and authoritative voice. "Count Conwell." The man immediately turned toward him. "As agreed," Clens's father continued, "admit your wrongdoing and fulfill the winner's demands." Count Conwell's face twisted with frustration and desperation. "I've lost my son and my exclusive knight. How can I—" But before he could even finish speaking, something horrifying happened. In an instant, it looked as though his head had been severed cleanly from his body. For a split second, everyone froze. Then the scene focused on Clens's cold, emotionless eyes as he stared directly at him. Delkin Conwell. The next moment revealed the truth. Delkin Conwell was still alive. His head had not actually been cut off. His entire body trembled violently as he frantically touched his neck again and again, unable to understand what had just happened. It had only been an illusion created by the terrifying pressure of Clens's power. Yet to him it felt completely real. Inside his mind, panic exploded. What was that? My neck, definitely. Sweat poured down his face as fear completely overtook him. Clens then stood directly before him and spoke in a chilling voice. "As the victor of this duel, I command you. Confess your sins before the Master of the North and kneel to beg forgiveness." His voice became even heavier, almost as if death itself was speaking through him. "Bow your head and beg for mercy, for you shall be crushed under the weight of your sins and repent." The moment those words entered Delkin Conwell's ears, true terror consumed him. He could almost see death standing directly above his head. His entire body shook uncontrollably, cold sweat dripped down endlessly, and even breathing became difficult. Unable to resist any longer, he finally broke down. "I was wrong," he stuttered fearfully. "My son and I dared to try and harm young Master Clens at the same time." The narration revealed the truth behind the terrifying ability Clens had used. This was originally a voice meant to call upon the souls of the dead. The dead man's voice. It was a soul-disturbing technique exclusive to necromancers, a horrifying power capable of inducing extreme terror in the living. Delkin Conwell completely broke down before Clens, trembling uncontrollably. He fell to his knees and bowed his head deeply while begging for forgiveness. "Furthermore, I insulted young Master's mother, Grand Duchess Claire," he confessed desperately. "Please forgive me." The people watching the scene could hardly believe what they were witnessing. One of the spectators stared in complete shock and muttered, "Am I really seeing this right now?" To think a pillar of the Branch family would crumble like that. Meanwhile, Clens slowly raised his shattered sword toward the sky. Even though the blade was broken, the pressure surrounding him only felt heavier than before. Then, in front of everyone gathered there, he began speaking with absolute confidence. "Good, it begins from here." His voice echoed across the entire battlefield. "Everyone standing here listen closely. A declaration of my existence." The atmosphere instantly became silent. To set this family right, I am the challenger of this trial by combat and its rightful victor. His eyes remained completely steady as he continued. The son of Grand Duchess Claire Ladilasis, and the second son of the North's strongest knight, Heinkel Rhineland. Then, proudly declaring his name before everyone present, he finished, I am Cleanse Rhineland. After that powerful declaration, the scene shifted to a completely different location. The atmosphere there was far calmer and heavier, almost sacred. A man could be seen entering a quiet hall while, nearby, a priest was praying softly. We shall go where your light does not reach. Even if the path is perilous, even if it is painful, please watch over our intent, O God of light. Just then, the man who had entered stepped forward and spoke. Cardinal Murak. The priest slowly turned toward him. Yes, Garrison. Your voice sounds grim. What's the matter? Garrison's expression remained serious as he answered immediately. The surveillance target was attacked. The attackers were a necromancer and his undead. For a brief moment, silence filled the room. I need to verify this, Garrison added firmly. I need to verify this personally. However, Cardinal Murak showed no sign of concern at all. Instead, he calmly replied, There's no need to worry about that. It was all part of the plan. He was dispatched in cooperation with the Empire. Garrison's eyes narrowed slightly. Cardinal Murak continued speaking as if explaining something completely reasonable. A necromancer is an existence that naturally incites fear. Those terrified by their appearance will inevitably seek out God. Countless people will flock to our holy order. Then his voice became even colder. Understand this, Garrison. If we can revive the holy order and spread God's will through just a handful of sacrifices. But before he could finish his sentence, Garrison suddenly moved. In an instant, he grabbed Cardinal Murak by the throat with overwhelming force. His eyes were filled with fury as he spoke through gritted teeth. A servant of the Holy Temple has fallen for petty, political games and made deals with heretics. The next moment, with nothing but raw strength, Garrison crushed the Cardinal's head completely. Blood exploded across the surroundings as the body collapsed lifelessly onto the ground. Right after that, another voice suddenly echoed through the area. Do you feel any better? The man slowly stepped forward through the blood-covered hall and looked directly at Garrison before speaking in a calm, yet mocking tone. You haven't changed, Garrison Veerman. To think you've killed more clergymen than the necromancers themselves have. A faint smile appeared on his face as he continued. The people of the Holy Order really ought to know what you're hiding inside that gut of yours. The narration then revealed the identity of the man standing there. He was the Archbishop of the Holy Order, Palamon L. Garrison glared at him coldly after hearing those words. Was this your doing, Palamon L? Palamon simply answered without hesitation. Of course not. I merely authorized it. Then his expression became more serious. And besides, he added, I brought a piece of information regarding your surveillance target. The moment those words were spoken, Garrison instantly moved to attack him as well. His fist shot forward with enough force to kill an ordinary man immediately. But Palamon's speed was far beyond normal. Before Garrison could even realize what happened, Palamon had already disappeared from directly in front of him and reappeared elsewhere, avoiding the strike effortlessly. Then Palamon calmly continued speaking as though nothing had happened. When necromancy is used, it inevitably leaves traces. He raised a strange cross-shaped object while explaining, This is the cross containing those traces. It belonged to the necromancer you killed. Garrison's expression hardened as he listened carefully. Palamon continued, One of the traces belongs to soul-returning arts, a type of necromancy that raises corpses on something the Empire is actively researching. Then his voice lowered, slightly, but the other trace is different. It resembles the original form of necromancy, one that manipulates souls rather than corpses. Garrison immediately reacted to those words. The original form of necromancy? Yes, Palamon answered. Calmly, the atmosphere suddenly became much heavier. It means there were two necromancers present at the scene. Then Palamon stared directly into Garrison's eyes and spoke slowly, making sure every word carried its full weight. Listen carefully, Garrison. Your surveillance target. The second son of the Rhineland family, A. Brief silence followed. Cleanse Rhineland is a necromancer.